How many times have you been told to read the Bible in its context? Now, how many times have you been told how to read the Bible in its context? That is the part that confuses people. And in short, all it really means to read the Bible in its context is to try to replicate what the biblical author's intent was when he was writing the text and how his audience would have probably received said text. So for example, when you're reading the Old Testament, you want the ancient Israelite living in your head. By contrast, if you want to read the New Testament, you want a Second Temple apocalyptic Jew living in your head. And at this point, you might just be thinking, well, Than, that's cool and all, but how do I do that? While this isn't all-encompassing, here is 6 different techniques or skills or habits that you can pick up that'll help you better do this today. First is to contextualize verses within the whole passage, chapter, or book it's written in. Now, I know this might seem really simple and easy, but let's just talk about it. When you find a verse that you want to understand more, ask yourself, what did I just read before this? What does the author say after this? Too often, I see people cherry-picking Bible verses to get to conclusions that they want. For example, Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." How many times have you seen that at a graduation party? If you open up Jeremiah 29, you'll find that this chapter is actually a letter, and it's not written to a college graduate. In fact, it's not written to any one person at all. The "you" in the letter is actually addressing all the exiled Jews. It's a response about a false prophet named Hananiah. And ironically, Hananiah had been prophesying prosperity to the Jews, and he prophesied that it would be fulfilled within 2 years. In chapter 29, Jeremiah not only refutes this prophecy, he also reveals that the Jews would not see freedom for more than 70 years. Number 2 is to contextualize verses in their chronological and geographical context. When you want to understand something in scripture better, you should ask yourself questions like, when was this written? And where was this written? For example, like we said in the beginning of this video, if I'm reading the Old Testament, I want the ancient Israelite in my head, where in the New Testament, I want the 1st century Second Temple Jew living in my head. Number 3 is to look at the extrabiblical literature from the surrounding nations, religious, and political competitors of the biblical authors. If you watch my video about dinosaurs in the Bible, you'll quickly understand why this is so important. This kind of data contextualizes the world that the biblical authors are living in and can help us infer the motivations and intentions of the biblical authors so we can better understand how to read the text. These next few points might upset some people, and if it does, I'm sorry, but this is important. Number 4 is that the Bible is a divine book and a human book. Put another way, God chose to use people to write the books of Scripture. People write using grammar and styles understood by their peers and with deliberate intent. And so the Bible did not just drop from heaven. Study it as though some person actually wrote it, not like it's the result of something dropping from the skies. Next is that you should, if possible, be reading and studying the Bible in its original languages. If you've not developed this skill at all, then consult different translations rather than just trusting one by itself. Once you do that, you can find differences in how those different translations render specific parts of the Bible, and then you should dig into why different translations have different renderings for different areas of Scripture. For example, I have an upcoming video on Genesis 3:16 and why I think the typical translation of it isn't correct. The standard example to go to with this particular topic is Deuteronomy 32:8. In this verse, some Bibles may read sons of Israel instead of sons of God. The difference is due to an ancient manuscript disagreement with major theological ramifications. Now, most English Bibles have sons of Israel, but when we look at the older manuscript traditions like the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually see sons of God there instead. Why is there a difference? This is a textbook example of how later scribes may have misguidedly changed the text in order to protect their theology. God, of course, doesn't need to be protected by any zealous scribe or anyone. Ancient Israel's doctrine was that God, or Yahweh, was the God above all the other gods in the divine council. But at some point, a Masoretic scribe must have found this idea offensive, and so changed the text. And number 6, the Bible must be interpreted in its context, not the context of the tradition that you abide by. Put another way, if you are letting your own predisposed theological commitments get in the way of how you're interpreting the text, then you're no longer doing biblical exegesis or Bible study. This doesn't mean that systematic theology or anything like that is not helpful. I'm only saying biblical theology is built from the ground up, not from the top down. You cannot take a Calvinistic or Arminian leanings and then interpret the text in light of those. This means that you should be reading the Bible with an open mind and being open to changing your theology as you come across different biblical data that might cause you to think that maybe this theological tradition or idea I hold to might not be accurate. This also means that the early church, the reformers, and all these other people who have written before us but after the corpus of the New Testament, while they're helpful, they too are not the context of the scriptures. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read them or take what they have to say seriously. All I'm saying here is that they are not the context of scripture. By doing these 6 things, you are on your way to better interpreting scripture and being a better exegete. Remember, the Bible isn't just a book. It's a window into history, culture, and humanity's spiritual journey. I hope that these things help you for the next time you're going to do a Bible study. What are some ways that you've already used some of these techniques in the past? What have you unearthed by using some of these techniques? Let me know in the comments.